Professor Paul Kengore. He wrote an outstanding book about Frank Marshall Davis, the untold story of Barack Obama's mentor. It's entitled The Communist. And Professor Kengore is crucially important now, his background and knowledge and his scholarship, to help us get in between Obama's rather substantial ears to understand what's going on right now, whether it's amnesty, whether it's the environment, whatever it is, this movement toward despotism, in my humble opinion, Professor. Do you agree with that?
Well, Mark, it's pretty bad. I mean, I'll put it that way. And it's interesting. I heard your first hour, and you used the words imperial decree. And imperial decree really rang true with me. And when you think of the people who influenced Obama and helped shape and mold him, including in particular Frank Marshall Davis, I mean, Frank Marshall Davis was all about imperial decree. I mean, this was an actual, literal, no exaggeration, a literal card-carrying member of the Communist Party USA. His card number was 47544, who joined the Communist Party in the Stalin era and literally pledged himself, like all Communist Party USA people did, to, quote, ensure the triumph of Soviet power inside the United States, unquote. So, I mean, he was...
Well, before we go there, how did Barack Obama meet him and know him?
Well, he was introduced to him, from what we could tell, and this is pretty clear. It looks like it was in the autumn of 1970. And the person who made the introduction, I mean, go back a little further. Frank Marshall Davis had been in Chicago. It was in Chicago where he joined the Communist Party, became so radicalized. He was the founding editor-in-chief of the communist newspaper in Chicago, which was the Chicago Star. That was late 1940s for a couple years. And then he went to Hawaii. And after being in Hawaii for about 10 or 12 years, and keep in mind, everybody in Honolulu knew about old Frank Marshall Davis, right? He was the old commie. And Barack Obama's grandfather, Stanley Dunham, this was his mother's father, and this shows how far to the left he was. He knew that his grandson, lacking a father at home, needed a father figure, and in particular an African-American father figure. So of all people, rather than picking the local Boy Scout troop leader or football coach or pastor at the local church, he picks this old, hardcore, Stalinist-era communist who was so radical that the Democrats were after him in the United States in the 1950s. And so they were introduced by the grandfather in the fall of 1970.
By the way, we're talking to Dr. Paul Kengore, the professor of political science at Grove City College, another wonderful university. The book is The Communist Frank Marshall Davis, The Untold Story of Barack Obama's Mentor. He has this mentor at a young age. His biological father, early on, also a communist. Mm-hmm. He gets very, very close to Khalidi at some point, who is a mouthpiece for Hamas. He gets very, very close to Bill Ayers and his wife for a period of time, as he's older, obviously. He spends 20 years with his wife in the church by Jeremiah Wright. Barack Obama's a radical, isn't he?
Oh, yeah, no question. And we could add here, too, Mark, his mother. I mean, his mother was very far to the left. I don't think she ever joined the Communist Party, but this is an amazing thing. Barack Obama's parents met in a Russian language class. I mean, I shouldn't laugh. It's crazy. They met at a Russian language class at the University of Hawaii in the fall of 1960. And they were learning the Russian language not because they were patriots who wanted to go work for the CIA and take on the Ruskies, right? I mean, they thought that Soviet Russia was the grand experiment, maybe had all the different answers, all the answers to all the world's problems. So they meet there. And so the mother and father are literally communists, at least small c communists. He's then introduced to this father figure, Frank Marshall Davis, who's a capital C member of the Communist Party. I mean, I've said before, and I'll say it again, and I know this sounds incendiary and crazy and even laughable to some people, and have leftists and liberals listening, rolling their eyes.
We don't care about them.
Right. We really have our first red diaper baby president. I mean, we really do. And that term, red diaper baby, I mean, there's a lot of people today I mean, there are people today who are patriotic, conservative Americans who were raised like that. I think of David Horowitz.
But red diaper baby, that's like a 40, 50-year-old term, right? To talk about these kids who are raised by communists.
That's right. You know, David Horowitz, Ron Radosh, who saw the light and changed, and today they're anti-communists. But Obama, what's fascinating about Obama's case is despite all these biographies that have been written about him, despite 2 memoirs even before the guy was president, he still has never gone through that radical upbringing, and one, acknowledged it, even though it's so clear, and then 2, it explained to us how and where he rejected it and left it behind.
Professor, don't hang up. We'll be right back. Really, dislike of representative government and constitutional limitations, where does it come from? Well, our guest, Professor Paul Kengore of Grove City, he says in particular it comes from Frank Marshall Davis, one of Obama's closest mentors, and a man who was a dyed-in-the-wool communist, a Stalinist, really, right, Professor?
Well, he joined the party in the Stalin era. And I mean, as anyone knows who joined the party in that time, and as anyone who's ever studied this knows, when you join the Communist Party USA, and this is what liberals don't get, still to this day they don't get this, when you joined the American Communist Party, you literally swore a loyalty oath to Stalin's Soviet Union. I mean, like I said, the pledge was to, quote, ensure the triumph of Soviet power in the United States. The president, the general secretary of the American Communist Party at the time, William Z. Foster, wrote this book called Toward Soviet America. I mean, they had that phrase, Soviet America. These guys talked of a USSA, making America part of the Soviet Union. So they were pledged to not only a dictatorship, but the worst of all possible dictatorships. I mean, no country killed as many people as the Soviet Union.
All right, but what I want to know here is the influence of Davis on Obama. How much time did they spend together? What kind of time did they spend together? How old was Obama, and so forth?
Yeah, well, Obama would have been about 9 years old when they met. Davis at this point was, he wasn't nearing the end of his life. I think he died in 1987. So they met throughout the 1970s. So at this time, Davis, he would have been in his 70s. Now, this is very important. I show this very carefully in the book. He was just as radical and far left then as he had been in the 30s and 40s. He was a member of a number of different communist front groups. How often did Obama meet with him? No one knows, but Frank Marshall Davis is mentioned, and by the way, he's only mentioned as Frank. Never full name, Frank Marshall Davis.
All right, so let's slow down. So in at least one of Obama's autobiographies, he knew...
Dreams from My Father.
He knew that if he mentioned this guy's name in full, it would set off red flares everywhere, wouldn't it?
That's right. Red flags, no pun intended, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yet he mentioned Frank literally dozens of times, and the only time... I went through and I counted. The only person that I could find him mentioning more, other than maybe his parents, but not his father, was the Reverend Wright. I mean, so if you were to find 2 top influences and mentors, it would have been the Reverend Wright and Frank Marshall Davis. Now, this is fascinating. In the audio version of the book, the original book came out in 1995, and then they re-released it when he was running for president in 2007, 2008. Well, they did an audio version closer to when he was running for president. And this is amazing, but I've sat there and I've listened to it, and I've had other people listen to it. In the audio version of the book, Frank Marshall Davis, or I should say Frank, is completely purged. Mm-hmm. He literally doesn't appear in the audio version even one time.